All right, guys. So we are continuing from where we left off from the last class in stats, and we have looked at the histogram in the last class, and now we're going to be looking at the statistical averages. Now, after we have organized our data, our raw data, in terms of a distribution table, whether it's a frequency distribution or a group distribution, then we may want to find some things about the data. One of the things we generally look at for the data is the average. Now, in statistics, we have three different types of average that are frequently used, right? And so we're going to look at those. So it says here, raw data does not mean much until it is arranged into a frequency distribution or represented by a histogram. To make raw data more meaningful is to try and find a single value which will represent all the values in the distribution. So an average then is a single value that is used to represent all the values in the distribution. Now that single value usually falls somewhere in the middle of all the values, right? And that middle value is what we really generally refer to as average. Now, when you think of a test score, if you do a test score and we give you a passing mark or a failing mark, it is usually measured based on the average. So the average of the score would be between halfway between 1% and 100%. So the average would be in the middle, which is 50. So most of the time, the pass mark for any exam would be 50, because that would be the average score that represents all the scores in the data, right? And so once you're finding averages, we are actually trying to find that middle value, all right? So a single value which will represent all the values in the distribution is called an average. Now, several kinds of averages are used in statistics. More important ones are the mean, also known as the arithmetic mean, the median, which is generally the middle value after you arrange the terms in ascending or descending order. And then we have the mode, which is the one when you organize the data, the one that occurs most frequently. All right, so these are the three averages that we're going to be looking at. Now, because these values often tend towards the middle value, they are also called central tendencies. Central means the middle, tendency means that's where they tend towards. All right, so we're going to start off looking at the mean. Now, most of you, if not all, would have met the mean before, because the mean is generally the one that we use when we refer to as average, right? From primary school, I think the first type of average that you learn is the mean, where you sum up all the values and you divide by the number of values, right? So when you get a set of values, you simply just add them up and divide by how many of them you have. So here, if you look at all of these values here, and we're to calculate the mean, then we would add up all of these values and then divide by how many of them we have. So if you count the number of values, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 values. So we're going to add up all the values and divide by 5. So when we add up all the values, we get 883.5. Divide that by 5, so we would get 176.7. Now this value would be the average or the mean value. And this would represent it would be the single value that represents all the values. And when you really think and you look at and compare it to the other values, you will see that the mean here supposed to be reflecting the one that is in the middle, right? If you look at the lowest value of all the values, the lowest one I think we have here is 174.8. That's the lowest value. Hopefully I'm correct. So that's the lowest one. And we look for the highest one. We would have 179.1. And if you notice, the one that we have for the average, 176.5, would fall between those two values, right? Between 174.8 and 179.1. This would fall in the middle between those values. So that would give you the mean. Another way you could think of the mean is if you have all the values and you add them up and you share them, divide them by the amount of them, then you will get an equal share in terms of the values. If you're to share the values equally among 5 values, each of the value would be 176.7. All right. So it can also be looked at in that way. All right, moving along. Now, sometimes we will have to find the mean of a frequency distribution. Now, a frequency distribution table will give you pretty much more values than just a few, because when we look at the values that we were dealing with just now, we only had 5 values. But when you have a frequency distribution table, generally it will consist of quite a number of values. Now, the frequency would tell you how much time a value occurs, right? Now, if you look at this table and I ask you, how many values are there in this table? What would you say to me? How many values are there in the table? Let me ask Mr. Ajeno. How many values are there in the table?
5, sir.
All right, let me see the hands of those who are in agreement with Mr. Ajeno. All right, Ms. Waysome. Is there anybody else who is in agreement? All right, so we have quite a number of persons in agreement. Is there anybody who is not in agreement? Anybody has any different idea? All right, I'm going to answer to mute your mic, guys. All right, now it is likely that you would just look at the left column and use that to tell you how many values you have. Clearly, you would count the number of values that we have here and come to the conclusion that you have 5 values. But that's not true, all right? If you should think about the frequency of these values, it will give you a different picture. Because when we have the frequency, it tells you how many times a particular value occurs. So if you look for on the value like 198, this value actually occurs 8 times. So it means that you have 8 of these values, 198, right? The value of 199, that occurs 30 times. So you have 30 of those. The one which is 200, that occurs 132 times, right? So when you really think, it's not 5 values that you really have. The amount of value that you really have is when you add up the frequencies, right? So to see how many values that you actually have, you would have to add the frequencies. And if we add the frequencies here, you would get 132 plus 8, that gives you 140, plus 7, that give you, 140 plus 3, that's 170, plus 30 again, that's 200. So in other words, you actually have 200 values, right? So because these values have occurred more than once, we just use the frequency to tell you how many times they occur. But if you were to write these values without the frequency, you would have a longer list in the left column than what we have, because it means that you would have to write the 198 value. You would have to write that 8 times. The 199 value, you'd have to write it 30 times, and then you would see that you would have a lot of numbers in the left column. Let me see the hands of those who actually understand what I'm saying, and if it is clear to you. All right, so I only saw 2 hands. Would that mean that the others of you don't understand? Ms. Taylor, do you understand?
So could you go back again, please?
All right. What I'm saying here, if I ask you how many values you have, it is likely that you would count all of these here. And if you count them, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you would probably come to the conclusion that you only have 5. But that's not the case, because these values occur more than once. The 198 occurs 8 times. So you'd have to write down this value 8 times. So you'd have 198, 198, 198, and you keep on writing that 8 times. And then you get to the next value, which is 199, and that value you'd have to write it 30 times. So you get what I'm saying now, Mr. Who was it, Mr. Was that Mr.
Campbell, sir.
Campbell? You get it now?
Yes, sir.
Right. So,
Yes, sir.
so it's not just one, because these values occur many times. All right. So you have to look at the frequencies just tell you how much values you really have in total. Say you add up these numbers and that tell you how many values you actually have. So it's telling you about those that are repeated. All right. Now, so when we add up all of these values, or we add up the frequency, we get 200. So the 200 here means that you have 200 lengths. That's what it means, you have 200 lengths in this column. And you know how many of the first value you have, how many of the second value, and so on. All right, so this is how you look at the table of a frequency distribution. Now, if we were to find the mean of these values, it means that we would have to sum them up, just as how we sum up all the values in the first example, and we divide by the amount of them. It means that we would have to sum up the values. And if we are to sum up these values, we would have to sum up how many values we would have to sum up, Mr. Shamar?
Please, sir.
Huh? How many?
Please, sir.
Yeah, how many values would we sum up to get the sum of all the values?
200, sir? Yes, sir.
Exactly, we would have to sum up all 200 values, right? Now, to sum up all the 200 values, we have to take into account how much of each value we have. So if we have the first value, which is 198, how many of that we really have? We have 8 of those. To sum up 8 198, you could add them, you could write them 8 times and add them, but you could also multiply the value by 8 because it's 8 of them you have. So if you multiply 198 by 8, that will give you the sum of the 8 values of 198. And if you multiply the 199 by 30, that will give you the sum of the 30 199 values, and so on. So to get the sum of each of these values, we first multiply them by their frequencies. All right. So when we multiply them by their frequencies, we get the sum of that individual value when we add up how many of them we have. All right, so it means that first you'd want to multiply these values by their frequencies to get the sum of those individual values, and then after we multiply them, then we add all the individual sums. All right. Now, if we are using the formula that we have here for the mean, this formula is saying to you that in order to find the mean, you need to find the sum of XF. Now, that symbol there, this symbol, we have that alpha symbol with that bar above it. That symbol means the mean. And this symbol, this fancy symbol here means the sum of. And XF means you multiply the length in terms of X times its frequency. So these are the values of X. You multiply them by their frequency, you get XF. Now, when you sum up all of the XF and you divide by the sum of the frequency, that's how you calculate the mean. All right. So if we add up all the frequencies, and the frequencies represented by the F, then we are going to first multiply. So it means that for this table, in order to calculate the mean, we need to add 2 more columns to it. Or 2 more or 1 more, maybe 1 more. All right, so what we need 1 more column. So we need a column for the frequency times the value, or the value times the frequency. And that's what we get. So this column, we refer to it as the X values. This column tells you the frequency of the X values. But the sum of the values, if you multiply 198 times 8, so you have 8 of the 198. When you multiply that 198 by 8, this gives you the sum of the 8 of them. So the sum of all 8 of the 198 will be 1,584. And so we are going to do that for all the values. So we multiply 198 by 8, we get 1,584. Then we multiply 199 by 30, we get 5,970. We multiply 200 by 132, and that gives you 26,400. Then we have 201 times 24. That gives us 4,822. And last but not least, if we multiply 202 by 6, we get 1,212. Now, when we multiply, we get the sum of the individual X values, but to get the sum of all the X values, then we have to add up everything in this column. And so when we add this column, we get a total of 39,990. All right, so that would give you the sum of all the values. Now, the number of values, it would be the sum of the frequency. So when you sum up the frequency, you get 200. So that gives you the sum of all, that will tell you how many values that you have, the amount of values, the number of values. So this is the sum of the values, except it's the sum of the values. And when you add up the frequency, you get the number of values. Now to find the mean, you simply just put these values in the formula. You put these values in the formula. So wherever you have the sum of XF, you put that above, and you divide it by the sum of F. So that would give you 39,990 divided by 200. And so the mean would be 199.95 centimeters. So this value, the mean, would be a single value that represents all the X values. It would actually fall somewhere in the middle of all of these values. All right, let me sit down to those who understand how to do the calculation of the mean using the table based on what I've just explained. All right, so very good. It's good to see that everybody has been paying attention. All right, so moving on. All right, so here's a table that we have here now. I'm going to just give you a little time, probably about 5 minutes, to calculate the mean using this table. And when you're finished, you raise your hand, give me your answer, then we check, then we'll check to see if your answer is correct. All right.
Just to find x of f, sir. XF, sorry.
Yes, you would have to find except.
Okay.
All right, so that means you will have to add another column to this table for except. Is that clear? So you may want to just add a column for except. So add a column to the right. So add a column to the right. And then now in that column, you will be calculating except. All right, and remember to get except, you need to multiply the frequency times the x values. All right, go ahead. So 1 times 2, you will get 2 here. So below this, you should have the sum of f. So this you should put in the what that's equal to. Over here, you're supposed to have the sum of xf. And you should say what that's equal to. All right, guys. Just raise your hand when you're through doing your calculation.